So here we are again, continuing on. And Jonas, okay, again, because my focus is on dilemmas and difficult decision making, which is really the focus that I wanted to talk about here. Are there studies on what happens in the brain in the presence of cognitive dissonance, a phrase that people like to use, or confusion in the brain at some level? You can define that better for me. I'm looking at it as it occurs in the presence of dilemma. So when we only have two choices. So are there studies? And if so, what did you find in those studies?
Yeah, there are studies. This difficult decision making has been a huge interest of psychologists, and this term cognitive dissonance comes from the social psychologist Leon Festinger back in the 1950s. And his idea was that when you encounter a choice and the choice that you're making is inconsistent with your attitudes or your beliefs, that you have this state of dissonance, which involves a negative emotion, negative emotional arousal. And we don't like that state. And so we take great efforts to avoid it and to deal with it and to get rid of those negative emotions when they come up. An example is I might find myself eating a hamburger, and I might also have empathy for animals. And I'm in this situation of how can I possibly be eating this thing if I care for animals, and how do I deal with that choice and that negative decision? And psychologists have studied this, and neuroscientists have studied it as well. From a neuroscience perspective, if we look at the brain imaging research, there are sort of two key findings that we see when in the brain when people are experiencing this state of cognitive dissonance. And the first is that systems in the brain that support what we call conflict, action conflict. You have two different responses that you could make, and the brain isn't sure which one to enact. And there's a particular system in the brain. There's a region of the brain called the anterior cingulate cortex. The dorsal part of the anterior cingulate cortex tends to become active when we're in this state of conflict. And there are two prepotent responses. The other thing is that brain systems that are involved in feeling bad, feeling negative emotions and negative arousal, like, for example, the anterior insular cortex, are also active. So you have this simultaneous experience of conflict and negative emotion that accompanies this state of cognitive dissonance, and we don't like it.
We don't like it at all. And it definitely interferes with being able to make a clear decision with any clarity, because as long as that emotion's there, it's hard to see clearly what it is we're being asked to actually make a decision about. So, okay, so are there studies, and I'm assuming there are because you're the Mindfulness Institute, on what happens in the brain when the subject can transcend this dissonance or perceive it as something other than conflict?
Well, that's very difficult to do. I mean, I think our natural response is to perceive it as conflict, and there's a lot of work looking at all the different strategies people have for overcoming this state of cognitive dissonance. I mean, on the one hand, you can change your behavior. I can stop eating the hamburger. You can change your beliefs. I can change how I feel about animals or about meat eating in general. And we've studied both of those things and why it's difficult for us to change our beliefs very often. And these negative emotions are very important for that. There are some studies showing that some exercises you can do that are related to self and identity might have some benefit here. So, for example, there's work showing that if you do things to pad your self-esteem, then information that challenges your beliefs is more likely to be perceived and accepted, because part of the reason we reject information that we don't like is because it challenges us, and so anything that allows us to transcend that feeling about ourselves is useful there. There's a study showing that specifically focusing on self-transcendence, exercises that help you to think about the world outside of yourself, to think about other people instead of yourself, also allows people to take in information that would normally make them feel dissonant. So there is some work there. We're really interested in whether mindfulness training can do this as well. If learning how to be more aware of what you're feeling and having a objective, non-judgmental stance towards it can help you process information in a more objective way.
So have there been any studies on people who are doing mindfulness oftentimes are focused on utilizing a both and perspective about things that go on in their life, that it's both good and bad, it's both up, it has an upside and a downside. And so in terms of the both and perspective, if someone is utilizing that perspective, and it changes the way they relate to the dissonance so that they're just like, yeah, it's a paradoxical thing. I say it can't exist at the same time, but it does, right? Eating a hamburger and feeling that, you shouldn't be eating a hamburger. That's a conflict. When they're in the both and perspective and they've shifted their way of looking at it to a broader understanding, let's say, or a broader story or a broader sense of identity, then it changes their behavior. I'm just curious if there's any work that's been done on that particular thing of where they're really going into both and perspectives as opposed to it's either this or that.
Right. I don't know of any research that has specifically looked at that, but it makes a lot of sense. And I think what you're saying is very important. And because of we are so complex and we make so many decisions every day, it's impossible to actually maintain some kind of consistent choice pattern. There's going to be contradictions within us, and we need to be able to accept those.
Yeah. And I think personally, that's one of the values of mindfulness and meditation, contemplation, the reflection, those kinds of things. It allows you to expand your frame, right? So that you're looking at something from a larger perspective. And I think that changes the story, changes the narrative, changes the self-concept, changes your sense of identity. I think all those things have to be happening, at least in the work that I'm doing with people, in order to make that shift away from it's a contradictory thing to it's a complementary thing. So to let it be both a complementary antagonism. Let's put it that way.
The other reason why I think mindfulness is potentially beneficial here is because when we feel something, a lot of times feelings can drive our behavior in a subconscious way. We're not quite aware. It happens so fast. The feelings the brain generates about a particular piece of information are immediate, and often that initiates a habitual response from us that unfolds before we even have a choice in the matter. So mindfulness can kind of put a stake in that process where it slows down. We are first aware of what we're feeling. We can acknowledge that we're feeling negatively about the situation, and then make a deliberate choice rather than an automatic one.
Yes, yeah, and I think mindfulness can continue to be applied to a lot of things as we become more able to do what you just said. Our mindfulness allows us some change to happen that wasn't possible before that. So it's a kind of an exciting time, actually, in that way. In your studies, do you denote a difference between cognitive dissonance and the emotional ambivalence that almost always accompanies it? In fact, it may be the same thing. I don't know. Do you distinguish those at all?
Well, I think cognitive dissonance, sort of by definition, incorporates a negative feeling. But I think ambivalence is something slightly different and doesn't need to be negative, right? I think we can tolerate, or we can learn to tolerate states of ambivalence, and they need not be negative. And that's probably part of being an emotionally sophisticated person and being able to handle and manage emotions well, is to be able to tolerate ambivalence and not to see it as something negative.
What would you, off the hand, what would you say is the difference between emotional ambivalence and cognitive dissonance in terms of experience?
Cognitive dissonance is this, conflict between what it is that you believe or want to believe, and what it is that you find yourself doing, and it's a negative feeling that's associated with that that conflict. But ambivalence involves two valences. The word's literally ambivalent. There's something positive and something negative at the same time. It's not just a single unipolar negative feeling.
So would you put emotional ambivalence closer to what happens in the midst of a dilemma versus cognitive dissonance or not?
I suppose they could both happen. Ambivalence could happen in the face of a dilemma for sure.
Yeah.
But a dilemma need not involve cognitive dissonance, I suppose, is the point you're getting at.
Okay. Okay. Good stuff. You know a lot about the brain.
Well, not relative to all there is to know.
So, okay. Let's take a break here for a minute and we'll be back.